I haven't been to a Toastmasters meeting since 1990, which was a year that happened once. Really, probably nothing more needs to be said about it, and I'm sure not that many of you maybe were around for it. But in high school in Sheridan, Wyoming, I was a member of the Rotary Club youth arm. I was chosen as one of the 2 junior Rotarians for that year, and our Rotary chapter in Sheridan was very active with our Toastmasters chapter, which met at like 6:30 in the morning. Bless them. But it was one of my favorite things to do my senior year, and met a lot of people from the community. There were a couple of city council members, there were bankers, every type of business person, some retired folks. It was a really interesting cross-section of the town I had grown up in, and people that I did not know that well. Being a high school student, I didn't have access to. And both the Rotary and Toastmasters programs made it a lot more comfortable for me to relate to other people who have different life experiences than I did, because those groups were very welcoming, and they were interested in the content of your mind and your ability to take an interest in the issues that were being discussed. And I had done Lincoln Douglas debate, original oratory, and extemporaneous speaking in high school forensics. I went to 3 national tournaments. I'm embarrassed to say I still have some of my plaques on the wall in my office, because I was really proud of them. And learning how to speak in public was difficult for me. I have a nice sort of gregarious mask in the work I do in the world. I go to donor meetings, I go to conferences, I work with our board of directors, some of whom are very prominent people in their fields. I manage the staff all day long. They would maybe even say that I do it well. But I'm an introvert. I like to read. I wanted to be a poet. But it was public speaking that got me interested in public policy and how the world works, how social change occurs, how democratic consensus is achieved. And my life since then has tracked at the nexus of public communication in my work as a journalist, and public policy in my work as a lobbyist and an advocate since then. And I would trace it all back to being 14, 15, 16 years old, doing public speaking programs and in high school and through Toastmasters. So it's really neat 23 years later to come back to a Toastmasters meeting and see that people are still doing it, because I think it's a really worthwhile program. Thomas mentioned where the Mathew Shepard Foundation comes from. The Mathew Shepard Foundation exists because people insisted it exist. When Matt was murdered, and news stories become prominent or get buried and forgotten about for a variety of reasons, usually involving whether they have interesting characters, interesting settings, novel circumstances, drama, and an uncertain cliffhanger ending, all of which were true of Matt's story in the 5 days he spent in intensive care after he was attacked and murdered. Millions of people worldwide mourned his death. There were candlelight vigils in communities all over the country. There were, including on the U.S. Capitol steps and in some of the smallest towns in Wyoming, towns of 50 or 100 people, like Mathew. People mourned his death because it was absolutely shocking. Even the Wyoming people, and maybe many of you don't know that much about Wyoming, many people learned about Wyoming when Matt was killed, and that was what they learned, was that a 21-year-old gay man was attacked and murdered in what has become one of the most notorious anti-gay hate crimes in American history. And it may be that that's all they know about Wyoming, or all they knew at that time. But Wyoming is 500,000 people living in 100,000 square miles. The major cities have 30, 40, 50,000 people in them and pass for our metro areas. The small towns are quite small, and the distances between those places are great. And it's lonesome, and it's cold, and it's windy, and people in Wyoming have gotten used to not being paid that much attention to by the world. So when Matt was killed, and it became a national story, and the President of the United States and members of Congress commented on it, and dignitaries from around the world came to his funeral, and his name became a household word due to the media coverage and the severity of the crime, Wyoming people reacted in a variety of ways, some of which were quite negative. There was a Yankee go-home feeling that pervaded a lot of the state. People who were not comfortable with the community, people who didn't want Wyoming spotlighted for this reason, or felt, in some cases, justifiably so, that the state was being held others of us who happen to be in the gay community took his murder very differently and felt very profoundly personally touched by it. That was a personal friend of mine, one of my partners, who knew the Shepard family, and those of us who were gay or lesbian in the state felt at that time that we had a spotlight thrown upon us that we didn't ask for, but that we had an opportunity to either crawl underneath something and say nothing and let it pass, or take advantage of the moment. And so I've joked a few times that if you do one principled thing in your life, you will never live it down. I outed myself in the newspaper where I was a reporter in an opinion column, remembering that as the person he was and not as a symbol, and hoping that the state would learn something from it and that the gay community could recover from how tragically they felt at that time. So I moved from a career in journalism through a career in journalism education briefly when Columbia Journalism Review, American Journalism Review, and other professional societies started to put me on panel discussions at journalism programs around the country to talk about how hate crimes, especially the LGBT community, are covered in our society and how journalists can be either ethically responsible or not ethically responsible in their coverage of that community. And that led to more and more work as an activist. I eventually became a lobbyist for wildlife conservation in Wyoming and moved to the state capitol for 8 years, working on those issues in front of legislators, doing a lot of impromptu speaking in very small committee rooms. When urgent decisions were being made at the table, lobbyists had a few moments to chime in from the end of the room. I'm eager to answer your questions about the types of public speaking I've done or the work that the foundation does, just to plant the seed of a few ideas that maybe some of you might be interested in. And it's odd that this is public speaking about public speaking, but I've done a lot of different kinds of it, so if you have particular interests individually about some of it, I would be really pleased to give you a little rundown of how I found myself in that type of speaking. But I've gone from sitting on panel discussions to moderating panel discussions. I've done lobbying, both the impromptu sort and the prepared testimony at the big table with the microphones in front of you type. I have moderated and led group and community discussions. I have given keynote addresses, introductions to people at galas. I have used a teleprompter. Anyone here would like to hear more about that? That is a really weird thing to get comfortable with using. And I've done a lot of media work. I've sat on camera for our organizational videos, for media interviews, for radio interviews, and I've watched someone who is truly expert at all those things, and that's my boss, Judy Shepard, and that's Mom, who went from being an ordinary person in Casper, Wyoming, to being a fixture of media coverage of the LGBT community and its straight allies. I've learned a lot from watching her very effective communication style in a lot of those same forums. So I've reached the red light. I'd love to open it up to questions if people want to know more about some of the specific types of speaking or some of our work. I should let you ask me. Thanks again for having me out here. Don't be shy. Everyone gets a wristband also, by the way. We put these out. They say erase hate. We have our website address on the back. Our great conversation started. We believe that the work of social change starts with people talking to one another. And so I do a lot of public speaking, but it's meant to get people talking individually with one another and break ice between them about whether we're being allies to people who are different from us. Do we stand up for those who are bullied or abused or discriminated against in this society because of their identities? The really important work of social change, things that drive the opinion polls in a different direction on a given social or civil rights issue, is individual communication between colleagues and family members and peers. That's where it all takes place. I absolutely guarantee it. So this is one of our little gimmicks to get people to go out and do that on their own. Yes?
I do have a question. It's a bit of a personal question. You can choose to answer it or not answer it. You mentioned that you stood up for what you believed in and it came out in a column. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, did you, in the town of Wyoming, did you suffer persecution as a result of making that stand?
A little bit, yes. When I wrote that column, it was an opinion piece, and I had written a lot of opinion pieces, and I was I was 26 years old, so I knew an awful lot about everything, and I was absolutely right about all of it. I had a glib quality that I somehow got away with, and this is a town of 50,000 people. It's about 2/3 Republican. It's a little older than average. It's a little culturally conservative in addition to being politically conservative, and there was no visible gay community. There still really is very little in the way of visibility for the gay community. So I wrote a column outing myself in Matt's memory and in his honor because I knew it would be provocative. I did get some crummy mail from people, some mean-spirited letters, maybe 10 or fewer. I think they were almost all unsigned. And I had this outpouring of the nicest things, cards from people I didn't know. Somebody sent flowers to the newsroom, I still don't know who sent them. Phone calls, members of the legislature who were openly and happily anti-gay, who called and said they really appreciated it and thought it took some courage to do. But I was definitely worried about it. Two of my editors told me I shouldn't write it. I put myself in a bad position with dealing with sources in the community. Maybe they wouldn't want to talk to me anymore. And I just felt like there was a moment there that we were all burning in this crucible of national media exposure, and who was going to stand up and say what Wyoming people really like? Was anyone? And I didn't feel that I saw a lot of leadership coming out of the governor or the other dignitaries that the state had to offer at the time, and that somebody ought to do it. So I'm really pleased that I was baffled how little negative repercussions there were. I found that it's really easy to convince yourself that people are homophobic if they never say anything at all about LGBT issues, but it turns out that they often, they're not. They can be quite supportive, actually. So that was a lesson I've carried with me since then, that you don't actually have to be afraid of that as much as, and believe me, I was afraid of it going in. It's misplaced, though, I think. Yes?
As a lobbyist, what would you recommend when you're advocating for change, and how do you engage people?
Mr. Chairman, you say things like Mr. Chairman an awful lot and project an air of deference as a lobbyist. What I was trying to do, specifically programmatically at that time, as above all else, and we worked on a lot of issues, was secure permanent state funding vehicles for preservation of wildlife habitat. Wyoming is sparse, but it's going to develop eventually. The oil and gas boom in the last several years has already chewed up an awful lot of places that critters use. So we tried to find that spot between fiscal conservatism and establishment of state fiscal vehicles that were permanent saving structures that kicked off interest that was dedicated to go to preserving land that had value to wildlife habitat for environmental reasons, but which also would do the service to the state of preventing the Environmental Protection Agency of having to come in 5 or 10 or 15 years and place the greater western sage grouse or any number of other species on the endangered species list, which would create fairly onerous requirements on property owners all across the state about how they could manage their property. And if there's anything conservatives in Wyoming hate, it's the federal government coming in and saying you can't use your property to its fullest extent because something's going to go extinct. So what always is the case in lobbying, whether you're lobbying for the gay community getting a fair shake or the sage grouse, or any other population that doesn't speak as loudly as it needs to, is to find what the enlightened self-interest of the people who hold the power is. And to do that in a way that